Jimmy Fallon asked a question. And Clint Eastwood's head dropped. The Tonight Show. A Tuesday night in late 2024. The studio was electric with anticipation. Clint Eastwood, 94 years old, Hollywood legend, a man who had defined American cinema for 6 decades, was sitting in the guest chair across from Jimmy Fallon. The interview had been going smoothly. Stories about directing. Anecdotes about working with actors half his age. Jimmy doing what Jimmy does best. Laughing genuinely, asking follow-up questions, making even a stoic legend feel comfortable. "So Clint," Jimmy said, glancing at his blue cards, "I want to ask you something. You've been making movies since the 1950s. That's 70 years of being on sets, working with hundreds of actors and directors. Is there one moment, just one, that you've never talked about publicly? Something that changed you?" It seemed like a standard interview question. The kind designed to get a good story, maybe a laugh, maybe a touching anecdote about Spencer Tracy or Sergio Leone. Clint Eastwood went completely still. His hands, which had been gesturing casually while he spoke, lowered slowly to his lap and clasped together. His jaw tightened. His eyes, those iconic eyes that had stared down countless on-screen adversaries, dropped to look at his hands. Jimmy noticed immediately. His smile faded. "Clint? You okay?" Clint didn't answer. He just sat there, head tilted slightly downward, staring at his weathered hands like they held an answer he'd been avoiding for decades. The studio audience shifted uncomfortably. The Roots stopped their light background groove. Questlove looked at Jimmy with concern. Jimmy stopped mid-joke. The entire studio froze. The control room went into immediate panic mode. "Is he okay? Did he have a stroke? Should we cut to commercial?" Producer Gavin Purcell was already reaching for the emergency protocol button. But Jimmy raised one hand slightly, a subtle gesture to the cameras to keep rolling. He'd done thousands of interviews. He knew the difference between a medical emergency and a man confronting something painful. "Clint," Jimmy said softly, leaning forward, his entertainer persona completely gone. "We don't have to talk about it if you don't want to." Clint's voice came out rough, barely above a whisper. "Her name was Sarah." Jimmy blinked. "Who's Sarah?" "The one moment I've never talked about." Clint looked up, his eyes glistening. "You asked for one moment?" "That's it." "Sarah Jennings. 1957, Korea." The audience was completely silent. 300 people holding their collective breath. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what happened in 1957. Clint Eastwood wasn't always Clint Eastwood, cinematic icon and directorial genius. In 1957, he was a 27-year-old contract player at Universal Studios, making $75 a week, getting bit parts in B-movies and forgettable westerns. He was tall, good-looking, but Hollywood was full of tall, good-looking guys. Nothing about him suggested he'd become a legend. He'd already done his military service, drafted in 1951 during the Korean War, stationed at Fort Ord in California as a swimming instructor. He'd never seen combat. Never fired a shot in anger. Never experienced war beyond teaching soldiers to swim before they shipped overseas. But in the spring of 1957, Universal sent him on a publicity tour to military hospitals as part of a morale-boosting program. Minor actors visiting wounded veterans, signing autographs, taking photos. Standard Hollywood charity work that looked good in the trades. Clint was assigned to visit veterans' hospitals on the West Coast. Most of the visits were brief. Shake some hands, smile for the camera, move on. The wounded soldiers were polite but distant, clearly unimpressed by a nobody actor from bad westerns. Then he arrived at Oak Knoll Naval Hospital in Oakland. The nurse who guided him through the wards was young, maybe 23, with dark hair pulled back in a tight bun and eyes that had seen too much for someone so young. Her name tag read, Jennings S. "Most of these men," Nurse Jennings told Clint as they walked through the rehabilitation ward, "won't care that you're here. They've got bigger problems than meeting a movie actor." Clint appreciated her honesty. I know. I'm not exactly John Wayne. No, she said, a slight smile cracking her professional demeanor, but you're taller. They spent 3 hours walking through the hospital. Clint met dozens of wounded veterans, men missing limbs, men with shrapnel scars, men whose bodies had survived Korea but whose eyes suggested their minds hadn't. He signed photographs. He shook hands carefully, aware of bandages and healing wounds. At the end of the tour, Nurse Jennings walked him to the exit. Can I ask you something? Clint said. Sure. How do you do this every day? See all this pain and just keep going? Sarah Jennings stopped walking. She looked at Clint with an expression that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Not anger, not sadness, just a bone-deep weariness that seemed far too heavy for someone barely out of nursing school. Because someone has to, she said simply. These men didn't ask to go to war. They went anyway. The least I can do is be here when they come back broken. Do you ever talk to anyone about it? Who would I talk to? She smiled sadly. Everyone I know either doesn't understand or is too busy dealing with their own pain. So I just carry it. Clint found himself saying something he'd never said to a stranger before. I'm staying at a hotel downtown for 2 more days. If you ever want to talk to someone who'll listen, I'll be there. No pressure. Just, if you need to. She studied his face, searching for ulterior motives. Why? Because I spent today watching men who sacrificed everything, and you're sacrificing yourself to take care of them, and somebody should acknowledge that matters. Sarah Jennings wrote down his hotel information. Clint didn't expect to hear from her. But the next evening, there was a knock on his hotel room door. She was wearing civilian clothes, a simple dress, her hair down for the first time. She looked younger, more vulnerable without the nurse's uniform armor. I probably shouldn't be here, she said. Probably not, Clint agreed. But I'm glad you are. They sat in his hotel room for 4 hours. She told him about Korea, not the battles, but the aftermath. The wounded who arrived on transport ships, the surgeries that saved lives but couldn't restore them, the letters she'd written to families explaining that their sons would never be the same. She cried. Clint held her hand and listened. I can't keep doing this, Sarah admitted. I thought I was strong enough. But every day there are more wounded and I can't carry all of it. Then don't, Clint said. You're not supposed to carry all of it. You're just supposed to show up and do what you can. What if what I can do isn't enough? It's enough for the men you help. It has to be. She looked at him with those exhausted eyes. You're going to be somebody someday. I can tell. You actually listen. You actually care. Hollywood needs more people like that. Hollywood doesn't care about listening, Clint said. They care about looks and money. Then prove them wrong. They talked until dawn. When she left to return to the hospital for her shift, Clint walked her to a taxi. Thank you, Sarah said. For listening. For not trying to fix anything. Just for being here. Will I see you again? She smiled sadly. I don't think so. You're going back to Hollywood. I'm staying here with the broken boys from Korea. But I'll remember this. I'll remember that someone gave a damn. Clint watched the taxi drive away. He never saw her again. Subscribe and leave a comment. Because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. 3 weeks later, Clint got a call from the hospital. Sarah Jennings had been found in her apartment. Sleeping pills. A note that simply said, I couldn't carry it anymore. She was 23 years old. Clint flew back to Oakland for the funeral. It was small. Her parents, a few nurses from the hospital, some of the wounded veterans she'd cared for. No one from Hollywood. No press. Just people grieving a young woman who had given everything to heal others and had nothing left for herself. One of the veterans, a man missing his left arm, spoke at the service. Sarah told me once that the hardest part of her job wasn't the blood or the surgeries. It was knowing she could never do enough. She saved my life twice, but she couldn't save herself from caring too much. Clint sat in the back of the funeral parlor and made a silent promise. He would remember Sarah Jennings. He would remember what she taught him about listening, about showing up, about caring even when it hurt. And he would try to be the person she thought he could become. He never spoke about her publicly. Not in interviews. Not in his autobiography. Not to friends or colleagues. Sarah's story was private, sacred, a wound he carried alone for 67 years. Until tonight. When Jimmy Fallon asked a simple question about one moment that changed him, and 67 years of silence finally became too heavy to carry alone. Behind the scenes, Fallon made a decision that defied every producer's expectation. Back in the studio, Clint Eastwood was still looking down at his hands. A single tear had escaped and was tracking slowly down his weathered face. Jimmy Fallon did something he'd never done in 15 years of hosting The Tonight Show. He stood up, walked around his desk, and sat down on the edge of it directly in front of Clint. No desk between them. No professional distance. Just two men in a conversation that had transcended television. "Clint," Jimmy said gently, "did anyone ever tell Sarah that what she did mattered?" Clint's voice was rough. "I tried to. That night in my hotel room. But I don't think she believed it. She was so tired. So worn down. And I was just some contract player from bad westerns." "Why would she believe me?" "Because you listened," Jimmy said. "You said she told you that nobody listened. But you did. That night mattered to her. You gave her something nobody else had given her, someone who cared without wanting anything back." "It wasn't enough," Clint said, his jaw tight. "She still died. But she died knowing someone had seen her. Really seen her. Not just the nurse. The person. You gave her that. You can't save people from themselves, Clint. But you can show them they matter. And you did." The audience was crying. Questlove had tears streaming down his face. The cameras kept rolling because everyone understood this was bigger than entertainment. Jimmy reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a pen, the pen he used to write thank you notes to guests after the show. He held it out to Clint. "I want you to have this," Jimmy said. "It's not much. But I use it to write notes to people who matter. To thank them. To tell them I see them. You taught me that lesson without even knowing it. Every interview I've ever done where I really listened instead of just waiting for the laugh. That's Sarah's legacy too. Because you're passing it forward. But this is the moment no one in the studio, and no one watching at home, ever saw coming." Clint Eastwood took the pen. He looked at it for a long moment, then looked at Jimmy with an expression that mixed gratitude and grief and something like relief. "I've carried her for 67 years, Clint said quietly. "Every movie I directed where I tried to show broken people finding redemption, that was for her. Every character I played who learned to listen instead of just being tough, that was her lesson. But I never told anyone why." He looked up at Jimmy, then at the audience, then at the cameras. "Maybe it's time people knew. Maybe Sarah Jennings deserves to be remembered. Not for how she died, but for how hard she tried to live." Jimmy's voice was thick with emotion. "She'll be remembered now. I promise you that." The audience rose. Standing ovation. Not the excited applause of entertainment, but the reverent acknowledgement of something sacred shared. Clint stood slowly, still holding Jimmy's pen. Jimmy embraced him, a real embrace, not a Hollywood hug. Two men honoring a memory together. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. After the show, Clint asked Jimmy to help him find Sarah's family. They located her niece in Oregon. Clint called her personally, told her everything, and established a nursing scholarship in Sarah's name at Oak Knoll Naval Hospital. Jimmy's pen stayed in Clint's pocket for the rest of his life. At his memorial service years later, it was buried with him, alongside a faded photograph of a young nurse named Sarah Jennings.